So, welcome so very much to this fall's first Resistance Studies speaker. We have another 4 that is coming up. On our website, you can find the presentations of the different speakers that are coming over the course of the fall. The next one is Lisa Brooks, a professor from Amherst College, talking about native New England resistance. And we also have a listserv you can sign up to on the website to get all our information about ongoing resistance activities in the UMass or Valley area. We also have some propaganda material with us, folder about the Resistance Studies Initiative, as well as the unique journal of resistance studies that we're putting out, since we're now into the third year with interdisciplinary approaches to resistance. We also have a sign-up sheet directly here where you can sign up for the listserv, and also some things to eat and drink if you want. For some of you, this is part of the undergraduate course, so there is an attendance sheet going around, so that's 2 different things. So,
There was another one of these that was partly, it's going around.
It's going around, okay. Great. So, with that, I am so happy to have Professor Margaret Cerullo here visiting us from Hampshire College. Professor of Sociology and Feminist Studies, who has been working with the Zapatistas since the beginning, 94. But more intensively perhaps in the times since 2001, and now with ongoing field study trips. And you're also teaching a number of other courses that are related to resistance, social movements, the situation in Cuba, feminist movements, and so on.
Yes, I see. You've looked me up.
We're very honored to have you here.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you very much.
So the plan is that we will listen about the Zapatistas and their resistance for about an hour, and then we will have open for Q&A.
Great.
And we will end at 6 o'clock. All right. Thank you.
Great, thank you. First, some caveats. I made this PowerPoint, and I'm not used to doing this, so you're my experiment, all right? So I've done small ones for my classes, but never one so large. So I started, and I don't know if that made it to your poster, with these 2 quotes, because Stellan asked me to talk about autonomy, the Zapatista Autonomy Project. And I thought these 2 quotes, and I hope I'll be able to explain them, one by Comandante Ramona and the other by Subcomandante Marcos, say something about, maybe something unexpected, about how the Zapatistas think about autonomy. And please feel free, since if I'm going to go on for an hour, I don't want you to get bored, so please raise your hands if you want me to clarify anything. Okay, and these were the questions that I posed. When the Zapatistas rose up in arms on January 1st, 1994, and shortly after began to negotiate with the Mexican government, autonomy was not one of their demands. So I think a first question is, how and why did autonomy emerge and now nearly become synonymous with the Zapatista political project? Scholars have claimed, and activists have claimed quite a bit for this autonomy project, that it's a challenge to neoliberal capitalism, settler colonialism, neoliberal multiculturalism, the patriarchal order of indigenous communities, and, in Stellan's terms, a heretofore unrecognized strategy of revolutionary nonviolence. Not recognized because the study of nonviolence has been state-centric. Yeah.
What is neoliberal multiculturalism? I don't really know what the term neoliberal means.
Okay, I hope, I hope that I can, that's a great question. But these are, yes, but I hope that I can, as I sort of explain, but that's great. So if you don't feel like I've clarified it by the end, ask again, okay? And so I want to try to get at what all of this project that so many claims have been made for, what it looks like on the ground. And then I also wanted to ask why this autonomy project has held such resonance for solidarity and other activists globally, and how has it been reimagined in different contexts? And that was what you posed to me, Stellan, which is that it's autonomy that everyone's interested in, he said, okay? And finally, what is the relationship between autonomy and other Zapatista initiatives since 2006, most recently, the postulation of an indigenous woman candidate for the presidency of Mexico in the elections of July 1918, all right, the elections that are upcoming. Okay, and here's where PowerPoint can be very useful. Instead of, I can actually tell you that these are the sources that I've drawn on. I think they're not super well known, so I thought it might be of interest to you. Melissa Forbes is my currently favorite scholar activist writing about the Zapatistas, and she has a long-awaited book called Engendering Autonomy about women's struggles. That book is not out, but she has several articles that you can search for on whatever you search for things on JSTOR. And then the next three sources are actually students of mine, right, who have been coming to Chiapas with me over the last 15 years. And I mean, I hope you don't think this is immodest, but Harvard had a very famous Chiapas project that ran from the late 50s until the 80s. And all these anthropologists went off from Harvard, students of a particular professor, to study what they saw in very classic modernist anthropology as what they called closed corporate communities. They thought that these indigenous villages were untouched by global, let alone regional or national forces. Meanwhile, people in these communities are migrating to work on the big coffee plantations and the oil fields, et cetera, so they weren't really closed corporate communities, but so it is. So I sort of liked, and they stopped in 1980, and so I feel as though my students have picked up since 2012, which is another important moment because most of the scholarship on the Zapatistas stops around then. It's very hard to keep a sort of rebellious and or revolutionary social movement in the consciousness of activists and scholars for as long a time as the Zapatistas have been operative. So since my students started going in 2012, their work on the Zapatistas picks up in 2012 and I think fills an enormous gap in the scholarship. So Dylan Fitzwater, Autonomy is in Our Hearts, Zapatista Autonomous Government through the lens of the Tzotzil language, which is, I promise you, is utterly fascinating. And I can reference it today, though it's not going to be at the center. Emily Kepler, The Zapatistas, a graphic novel, another Hampshire Division III, which is a great introduction to the Zapatistas. Tristan Cullen, Reimagining Revolution, the Zapatistas as a Decolonial Social Movement. This is very different from the Harvard Chiapas project. Max Carter, Movimiento desde Adentro, Movement from the Inside, 30 Years of Zapatista Women's Struggles. And two other sources that I really commend to you. One is El Quilombo Intergaláctico, which was a Zapatista solidarity group. You can also look them up, that published all kinds of, they translated and published a lot of the Zapatista communiques, but also their own political analyses, kind of in the spirit of Zapatismo. And they were a project that existed in Durham, North Carolina, as a physical space for 9 years. It was a community center, a cafe. They had neighborhood, they had barrio assemblies, and it was in a sort of low-income immigrant and student and poor people neighborhood, and they had to close their doors 2 years ago. Guess why? gentrification. Their rent was tripled and their community was disappearing, and which is, I want you to think about that. But they've continued, and if you follow their link, they will take you to something called the Intercultural Workshop, which is another, something like that, but which is another website that I think publishes really, really great political analysis. And finally, the other source that I would recommend to you is, you can find these online, the textbooks of the Zapatistas' little school. And there's been grade 1 and grade 2, and you can find all the textbooks for grade 1 in both Spanish and English online, okay? So those are more or less my sources. So I thought I would start, and it was very helpful that I spoke to some people at the beginning, assuming no knowledge of the Zapatistas. So forgive me if I'm taking you through stuff that you already know, but I think that there might be people here for whom this is maybe a useful context. And there's another book which is useful called The Fire and the Word by Gloria Munoz. And she conceptualizes the history of the Zapatistas since 1983, not 1994 when they emerged into public, in 3 phases, what she calls the fire, the word, and autonomy. All right? So the period of the fire is actually very, very brief. It's from 1983 till 1994 when the Zapatistas actually became public. In 1983, they formed and began to organize clandestinely in the Lacandon jungle, which is a part of Chiapas, the northeastern corner of Chiapas. Melissa Forbes recently pointed out that it roughly corresponds to the area of the Diocese of San Cristobal, which is interesting, since the Diocese of San Cristobal, that is to say the Liberation Theology Catholic Church, had a very significant role in the prehistory of the EZLN, which we could talk about if anybody's interested. It was formed, the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, was formed in the jungle by 3 mestizos and 3 indigenous. Okay, and Subcomandante Marcos has written about that period, and from the beginning, the Zapatistas adopted a kind of anti-heroic style. So in the prologue to the first collection of Zapatista communiques that was published in English, The Shadows of Tender Fury by Subcomandante Marcos, begins with a description of what it was like to organize this guerrilla in the mountains, which has a certain still like romance for some, and there are many guerrilla memoirs that people have read. Fire in the Mountain by Omar Cabezas, I think might be one about El Salvador. So I read Subcomandante Marcos as a parody of the guerrilla memoir. He begins by saying we didn't know which was worse, the nostalgia or the diarrhea, as he describes climbing up and down hills and how the compañeros always drank their water on the first day, so all they had left to eat for the whole rest of their long march was corn gruel with no water, and how they used to at night around the campfire talk about all the food that they could only imagine or they once had, like tamales and tacos and cakes, and that would at least make them laugh because they had no water left in their bodies to cry. So that is the sort of, the story of the formation of the guerrilla, and that is followed in turn in the same introduction to the early communiques by the story of the parrot and the macaw. And Subcomandante Marcos says, all this I've been telling you about climbing the mountains and having no water and food and dreaming of tacos, that's just scenery for the story I really want to tell you. And so he describes finally reaching base camp, and his radio is making an enormous amount of static noise, and he can't get any channel to figure out what's going on in the world. And that's very important. If you're a political revolutionary, you have to know what's happening. And so he decides to take the radio apart and see what the problem is, and out of it fly 18 birds, parrots and macaws in there, and now he understands the source of the static, and he thinks, shit, why didn't I clean this before, and I wouldn't have had this problem. Not only that, but as he's going along, cleaning out the poop, he finds a little egg. and a note. And the note is written by a parrot, explaining, so the letter says, that she had fallen in love with a macaw. But the parrots did not think that it was appropriate for a parrot to mate with a macaw, given the purity of the race. So they had to conduct their affairs clandestinely and in secret. And this little egg was the product of their, well, how is it put? As parrot is fire and macaw is wood, along came the devil and told them they should. And this egg was the product of their illicit liaison, and whoever found it was implored to take care of it. And and there were various instructions for the care. Anyway, it gets very, very complicated, because when the egg finally bursts, it's not the bastard child of a parrot and a macaw, but of a parrot and a tapir, and which has now plumed feathers, because the parrot actually was two-timing the macaw, et cetera, and tried to cover with this. All right, so I had always read this story as, like the parody of the guerrilla memoir that precedes it, as a parody of magic realism. Because what do you expect when you're reading a story from Latin America? Is you expect bastard children of parrots and macaws and tapirs, or tapirs with wings, etc. All right, but one of my brilliant students analyzed it differently, and I think much more deeply and interestingly. She read it as a metaphor precisely for the meeting of those three mestizos and three indigenous that fell in love and formed this bastard child, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation. And the job of Subcomandante Marcos was to nurture and take care of that army until it could do what it had to do in the world. So I think that's a really interesting, very Zapatista understanding of the construction of Zapatista political subjectivity. Another story that the soup told somewhat later, which may be well known, is called The Story of the Others. I don't know if you have ever encountered. It's one of the better known ones. And it comes because he's been asked to write a letter to Solidarity supporters all over the world who have just demonstrated in 1997 in support of the Zapatistas after the government committed a massacre. And he describes his perplexity. How does one write a letter to someone I don't know in person, who perhaps speaks a different language, has another culture, probably is from another country, may be of a different color, and without a doubt has a different history? So in the midst of his perplexity comes old Antonio, who's the figure of the indigenous man who has advised the mestizos during the whole time of their preparation. And he always comes to the soup's rescue when he's stuck, and old Antonio tells him the story of the great gods, the first ones, those who created the world. There were 7 of them, and the problem was that they were all different, each from the other, and they couldn't go about the business of creating the world until they figured out a way to resolve those differences. And they were started out by all screaming at one another and all talking at the same time, and they finally had to learn to listen. And only once they did that and recognized that their differences might not be an obstacle to a common project, but might be a path toward a common project, could they begin the business of creating the world. And another member of my collective figured out that those 7 first gods were the 7 indigenous groups that initially composed the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, who had to figure out how to deal with their differences in order to create a nosotros, right? A subject, a we that could fight together. All right, so that's at the very beginning. All right. So as you know, in 1994, the Zapatistas surprised the world by rising up, and at the very day that NAFTA was to go into effect. And it was, I think, that broke the camel's back, that led to the uprising, was in 1992, in preparation for NAFTA. Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution was revised under pressure from the United States. And Article 27 was the embodiment of the legacy of the Mexican Revolution. You know, the famous Mexican Revolution of Emiliano Zapata, which was fought under the banner of the land belongs to those who work it, right? And the great achievement of the Mexican Revolution was land reform, which took a very long time to arrive to Chiapas, and there were many, many, many pending land claims in Chiapas. Article 27 comes along and it says it's all over. It's the end of land reform. Land is no longer communal property. It's a commodity. It can be bought and sold. All right? That's neoliberalism. It turns everything possibly collective, possibly communal, into private property and profit making. Okay? So that's one. I mean, that was the way neoliberalism really deep implanted itself, I think, or most dramatically implanted itself. And Subcomandante Marcos said, quote, "This was the door that was closed on the indigenous to survive in a legal and peaceful manner. This is why they rose up in arms, to be heard because they were tired of paying such a high price in blood. There's no question about consensus over the armed struggle. We either die in struggle or we die anyway." And they've clearly stated it's better to die with dignity. So that was the uprising. They had 11 demands: work, land, housing, food, healthcare, education, independence, freedom, democracy, justice, and peace. And when asked by a reporter, and you may notice that autonomy is not there, asked by a reporter how many of them they were, the reporter had heard 200. The Pentagon would later say 1,500. The compañero answered in typical Zapatista fashion, "Somos un chingo, we're a shitload." So that they were a shitload of Zapatistas rose up on January 1st because they decided to die on their feet, and since they were going to die anyway, all right. And their first declaration, the first declaration of the Lacandon jungle, "We are the heirs of the true builders of our nation, the dispossessed. We are millions, and thereby call upon our brothers and sisters to join this struggle as the only path, so we will not die of hunger due to the insatiable ambitions of a 70-year-old dictatorship, the dictatorship of the pre-party, the party of the revolution institutionalized, which had ruled Mexico for 70 years. They issued a declaration of war ordering their troops to advance to the capital, defeat the Mexican Federal Army, and they hoped to inspire others to rise up. That's not exactly what happened. And instead, the government immediately sends in 16,000 troops. The number of federal troops was to rise to 30,000 troops, like a third, I believe, of the Mexican army, and they sent all the apparatus of a major war, Hummers and tanks and surveillance apparatuses and low-flying helicopters. So Chiapas became a war zone. Then, on January 12th, there were massive demonstrations in Mexico calling for a ceasefire. And under pressure, the government agreed to a ceasefire. So in the framework of Gloria Muñoz, fire only lasted, that is armed struggle, only lasted from 1983 until January 12th, 1994. Now, since that date, the government has repeatedly violated the ceasefire, as I will discuss, and the Zapatistas never have, okay? So that's, they fought only for 12 days, all right? Whoops, let me go back. Okay. Another important date, since we're going to be talking about autonomy, is December of 1994, that very first year. In what they called a nonviolent military offensive, the Zapatistas occupied 38 municipalities, which have become the basis for the autonomous municipalities of today, okay? I think this is really, really important, that land is the material basis both of survival and autonomy. It has come to be embodied Zapatismo and therefore is the logical target of counterinsurgency. whose goal is to unsettle the geography of resistance, that is to say the land recuperated by the Zapatistas before, during, and since the uprising. All right. Now let me tell you a few more. I'm not going to go through Zapatismo, I promise you, in this detail year by year, but I wanted to give you some sense of what this movement was about, what motivated it, etc. Okay, in 1995, Carlos Salinas in 1994 exits the presidency, and there's a new president, Ernesto Zedillo, who speaks about dialogue and unleashes vicious counterinsurgency forces. In February of 1995, they pursued a scorched earth policy in Zapatista territory, razing homes and entire villages in pursuit of the general command and especially Subcomandante Marcos. Right? And coinciding with this, Zedillo unmasked Marcos. Right? And so I thought it's time for a picture because it's been so many words. And it was kind of this utterly ridiculous media spectacle where he went with the picture of somebody named Rafael Guillen and Subcomandante Marcos, and they kept doing this, like it was Etch-a-Sketch, or putting this mask over this guy's face and saying, see, and Subcomandante Marcos responded by saying, well, he sounds like an interesting guy. I wouldn't mind having coffee with him. And the population of Mexico responded by another set of massive demonstrations under the banner, "We are all Marcos. Todos somos Marcos." All right. So making a mockery of the government's effort to make a mockery. And also, as you see, I've quoted the soup, but I'm trying to kind of displace his centrality, which is very difficult because he's such a charismatic personality and because that's what the media love and want and look for. But he doesn't appear on January 1st, and I've just been rewatching some Mexican-made chronicles of the Zapatista rebellion. He doesn't appear until the way he appeared in our media, which is addressing a group of tourists on January 1st, 1994, saying, please excuse the inconvenience, but this is the first time we've made a revolution. So anyway, so his role from the beginning was to be the spokesperson, the interface between the Zapatistas and the rest of the public, partly because very few of the Zapatistas at this point felt confident speaking Spanish. So it was, it was great to have this spokesperson. Okay, in 1996, in January 12th of 95, the Zapatistas declare a unilateral ceasefire. They say, forget what the government does, and that ceasefire has held, which I think is one of the most extraordinary testaments to the discipline of this movement. As you will maybe see, they have been under constant, I hate the term low-intensity warfare, because it's not low intensity if you're the target. I don't quite know what would make it higher intensity, but they have been under siege, low-intensity warfare, since the beginning. Okay. So in February of 1996, the San Andres Accords were signed. They kept negotiating with the government, as I said, the forked tongue, Zedillo. And these were accords on indigenous rights and culture. And they became a referent of the movement from 1996 all the way to 2001, and I'll come back to that. But I wanted to take half a minute to talk about San Andres, because the San Andres Accords, are iconic, and for anybody who knows anything about the Zapatistas. And I wanted to show you some pictures of San Andres because it really captures something about Zapatismo today. San Andres is an old market town from pre-Columbian towns, but it's a little tiny place. And I always laugh to imagine what it was like in 1994, 1995, and 1996 when the international media arrived there. There was barely any electricity, but leave that aside. So in the Zapatistas Zapatistas occupied the town in 94. A few years later, the anti-Zapatistas took the town, and in a famous example of the Zapatista internet, somehow the word spread through the highlands, and thousands upon thousands of Zapatistas entered San Andres and retook the town. So it's been and this is very typical. So here is San Andres. And then, whoops, no, I want this. Okay, now, I don't know if you can see right here, but this says the Office of Bienes Comunales. And every pueblo in Mexico has an Office of Bienes Comunales, which basically deals with land issues. And it says San Andres Larrainzar. So San Andres Larrainzar, that's the official name of San Andres before the Zapatistas rose up. Larrainzar was a conquistador, so they gave him, or a big landowner, right? So they over here is the Oficina de Bienes Comunales Autónomo. So here's the official one, and here's the autonomous one. And this is called San Andres Sacamchem de los Pobres, which is, it's been reinscribed with an indigenous name. But look at, they exist side by side. This is around the corner is the Presidencia Autónoma, the autonomous municipal center, and then around another corner is the official municipal center. And then I'll just show you two more. This, you can't quite read it, but this is the Biblioteca Autónoma, the autonomous library. And you can tell it's Zapatista because there's this mural at the end. And this is my favorite. This is the plaza of San Andres, and every Mexican village has a plaza and has a kiosk. This is the official kiosk, and over here behind the trees is the autonomous kiosk. All right, so I thought that was maybe of some interest, just because when we speak of Zapatista territory, it's not liberated territory that is completely liberated and held by Zapatistas. Zapatistas exist side by side, at least in the highlands, with non-Zapatistas, and have had to figure out a way of living together with them, and have actually, some have argued, seen this as a strategy to prevent a scorched earth policy, like as in Guatemala, right? So if you're living side by side with non-Zapatistas, the government can't risk it, okay? There used to be, well, that's a long story, there used to be a way to tell who was who, because the non-Zapatistas accept handouts from the government, the Zapatistas don't. So anybody who had a new roof was non-Zapatista, and that always scared me. I thought, from standing above, you could look at the pueblo and figure out who was who. But luckily, the Zapatistas have banned alcohol, and of course the Partidistas not. So the Partidistas, spend all their money on alcohol and getting drunk, and they sell off their roofs to the Zapatistas. So now you can't tell who's who. So that's, to me, as I said, is a bit of a relief. Okay, so I guess I'm going to keep going. 1997 was the famous massacre in Acteal, in which government-trained paramilitaries murdered 45 women and children in a church. And what was important about them was that they weren't Zapatistas. They were members of a very religious Catholic organization called Las Abejas, the Bees, and they were nonviolent. They supported the Zapatistas, but they didn't take up arms. And so the Zapatistas understood this to be very, very significant, that the target of paramilitary violence would be sympathizers of the Zapatistas. And that's one of the ways that's one of the ways that counterinsurgency works, to disrupt the social fabric and to peel off people who don't have the same full commitment who might otherwise be sympathizers. 2000, this famous 70-year dictatorship falls, and the party of the revolution institutionalized, falls to the PAN, the right-wing party, and Vicente Fox comes into power. He was sort of a cowboy. He got along very well with George W. Bush. They used to be cowboys together. That was, just to recall, I don't know what they did. I guess after Brokeback Mountain, that sounds weird, but anyway, he said he was going to solve the problem of Chiapas in characteristically arrogant fashion in 15 minutes. He didn't do that, and Chiapas remained a war zone. Now, remember those San Andres Accords on indigenous rights and culture that were signed by the Zapatistas and the government in 1996? They were never implemented. Right? So Zedillo just put them in a drawer. And so now that Fox comes to power, the Zapatistas think, okay, now's the moment to like really press for the Congress to ratify the San Andres Accords. So they march from Chiapas to Mexico City, the march of the people of the color of the earth. And this was really a high point, I think, in Zapatista I don't know, what do I want to say? Embraced. They were deeply embraced by all of Mexican society all along the entire route from Chiapas to Mexico City. Comandante Esther, a woman, indigenous woman, spoke to the Mexican Congress, and most of the parties, it's shocking when you see scenes of Comandante Esther. She spoke to a largely empty Congress because most of the members of Congress did not deign to dignify the presence of an indigenous woman speaking to them. So in April, all three parties of the right, center, and so-called left signed a watered-down version of the San Andres Accords that was completely unacceptable to the Zapatistas and all other indigenous peoples of Mexico. No autonomy, no control over resources, okay? This is neoliberal multiculturalism, to go back, right? So what it says is, speak your language. You know, not that we'll teach it in school, but we could have cultural events and wear your traditional costumes and display indigenous culture, because aside from anything else, it's really good for tourism, right? But rights to self-determination, rights to control over land, rights to control over resources, rights to govern yourselves according to your principles, no, forget it. So that's multiculturalism, very, very light, right? Or resource-free multiculturalism. And,
That's good, research-free.
Oh, I got that from somebody I read this week, but yeah, so, whoops. Okay, so this was my little tour through San Andres. And where do we go? Okay, since I get, as I said, whoops. All right, this one I couldn't make come. So remember Gloria Munoz, the fire, the word, and autonomy, all right? So the word references this period of attempting to engage the government. You know, the Zapatistas sort of were revolutionaries. They wanted to, in the classic way, seize state power. But when that didn't happen, it became very quickly apparent that it wouldn't. They negotiated with the government. They looked for honest interlocutors. By 2001, the congressional betrayal, it became clear that that was not going to work, and so they declared autonomy. Okay, and they constructed 5 major centers of Zapatista autonomy in this part of Chiapas that they more or less control, and they called them caracols. And caracol is the conch shell, all right? And it's what is used in Chiapas and elsewhere to call people to assembly. So when the men are in the fields and the women are in the home and the priistas are occupying San Andres, the conch shell calls people to assembly to figure out what to do. I wasn't going to put these up, but you will soon see why. These are the 7 principles of Zapatista autonomous government, and we can come back to them. They sound so much better in Spanish, like servir y no servirse, representar y no suplantar. They're not as good in English as in Spanish, but anyway, so they are. And we will come back and discuss those, okay? And the key is mandar obedeciendo, to govern by obeying. And when you arrive in a Zapatista community, it says, this is territory Zapatista, here the government, the people command and the government obeys, okay? So what's this? And then this is to quickly take us to the present. 2006, this is one of the major initiatives. So here's the point that I want to make is, yes, while the Zapatistas have been constructing their autonomy, and I'm going to go in the next part of the talk to try to go into depth about what that exactly means, they have also constantly been looking for ways to extend their project to the nation and internationally. And the strategy of the government and part of the counterinsurgency has been to say this is a problem of Chiapas, of this one small corner of our country. This is an indigenous problem. And the Zapatistas have always pushed so hard against that to say no. Our agenda is national and beyond the nation, because they also say we rose up against the Mexican state in 1994 and then we discovered it didn't really exist, that it was the handmaiden of international capital. So anyway, so their project is much bigger than can be encompassed by the Autonomy Project. So the other campaign was launched in 2006, coinciding with the presidential elections. Every 6 years in Mexico, there's a presidential election. And what the Zapatistas decided to do, and frankly, I really think if we want to take one direct lesson, I don't understand why we don't launch another campaign every time we have presidential elections. Because what the idea is that's the moment. For a year, the entire population is focused on politics, for better or for worse, but it's unavoidable. And so why not use that moment to try to produce another agenda that is not the agenda of the political parties, or as the Rainbow Coalition used to say, ask for what you want, not for what you think you can get. So that's sort of the idea of the other campaign. The Subcomandante Marcos went around the country on a motorcycle with the penguin, always theatrical. I still haven't figured out what the penguin was doing. But he went from town to town, to village, and there's a fabulous movie that captures that trip. And what he discovered was the incredible predations of savage neoliberal capitalism, that there wasn't a waterfront or a plant or a little piece of earth or a tree that wasn't in the process of being taken away from the people that it had belonged to and turned into merchandise. Okay. So I'm blah blah blah. I think that the next important thing that really is unavoidable is the drug war in Mexico, and the Zapatistas end up having to respond to that. And I put this down here in 2011. Cherán, Michoacán declares itself autonomous because there's a graduate student here in Latin American Studies, Ana, who works on Cherán. And it's just important to know that the Zapatistas are not the only communities in Mexico that have declared themselves autonomous. And they kicked out the authorities and the police force and the loggers in Cherán, and for up until now and it's starting to fall apart, but have controlled their community. Okay. Okay. Then the Zapatistas were silent for a while until December 21st, 2012. Does that date ring a bell to anybody? Do you remember what was supposed to happen? Huh? The end of the world, according to the Mayan calendar, right? So the Zapatistas, who had been silent for the last few years, on December 21st, 2012, 20,000 of them appeared in all of the municipalities that they had occupied in 1994. And what they did was it was a silent march, and they marched, and then they put up a stage, they marched across it, and then they dismantled it and walked off the scene. And they issued, the SUP issued a communique that was one of his shortest ever. Do you hear it? It is the sound of their world crumbling and ours being born. Then the supplement to that was, when there weren't cameras, microphones, pens, ears, or eyes, we existed. When they slandered us, we existed. When they silenced us, we existed. And here we are existing. Okay. So, well, we can talk about I think it's pretty fascinating, what that meant. And then very quickly, this takes us up to today, and then we can talk about autonomy. In 2013, Subcomandante Marcos died and was reborn as Galeano. Not Eduardo Galeano, but Galeano was the nom de guerre of another Zapatista, obviously taken in homage to Eduardo Galeano, who was killed by paramilitaries. So once he was killed, Subcomandante Marcos was reborn as Galeano, and now he is Galeano, and he's they've been in a constant struggle to displace his centrality, and that's the most recent. September 26th in 2014, I put that there, Ayotzinapa, another moment in which Mexico came into the world media spotlight with the disappearance of 43 students from a rural teacher training college. And then today, right now, the 2017, the candidacy of an indigenous woman for the presidency of Mexico. That's what I had thought I should talk about when Stellan originally told me, but tell me, how do I get to 17? Oh no, I don't want that at all. Whoops. I think these all come later. Okay, now I'm going to talk about autonomy and spare you the PowerPoint. Did that work? More or less? Yeah? Okay, you can tell me afterwards if you have some tips. I come back to it to do a few other things. So what is this autonomy thing that everybody says is challenges neoliberalism, neoliberal multiculturalism, patriarchy, colonialism, etc. Okay, so let's take them in turn. Okay. Those who have suggested that it's a challenge to neoliberalism propose that what the Zapatistas have constructed in their autonomous communities, a system of schools, clinics, a system of justice and local governance, articulate and enact collective priorities independent of the logic of the market. So if neoliberalism is nothing can exist that can't be turned into a commodity, that can't be marketized, the market is the only principle of thought and possibility, along come the Zapatistas and attempt to create something that, as I said, enacts collective priorities. And absolutely crucial, as I also suggested, is the land, right, as a challenge to neoliberal multiculturalism. And when I went to the Escuelita, whenever one goes to a Zapatista community, the land is absolutely central. So that the family I stayed with, the father would always say, as far as you can see is ours now. And that, as I said, is the material of survival and autonomy. And therefore, the new strategy of counterinsurgency is to figure out not military but legal ways of expropriating the Zapatistas from that land. So what the government has been doing for the last 10 years is issuing certificates of land entitlement to anti-Zapatista campesinos, indigenous campesinos, so that then there can be a conflict between the Zapatistas and another group of indigenous people, you know, what they love, what they call intracommunal violence, what they blame the Acteal massacre on, do you remember, I always think of that South Africa, black on black violence, where they never talk about the conflicts in the Balkans as white on white violence. Anyway, intracommunal violence is something that the government has actively fomented as a strategy of counterinsurgency. And I think that's really important to think about in terms of understanding what are some of the resonances for those of us who live in a very different context, but also under neoliberal assault. And I started talking about El Quilombo Intergaláctico, the assault on spaces, alternative spaces of collective possibility and imagination, I think is absolutely crucial to the neoliberal project, and its form is gentrification. So recently I was reviewing a book. This is a little diversion, but not too much. It was a diversion about it's called Lavender and Red. It's about the lesbian and gay left, who knew there was such a thing, of the 1970s and 80s. And there's a chapter of that book that's devoted not to a campaign, but to a phenomenon, the lesbian collective household. And the argument is that the lesbian collective household sustained a powerful culture of resistance. It became a place where people in the political underground sought refuge, when they were fleeing from the state. Later, women accused of having murdered their rapists also were seen as, by people living in these households, as also political fugitives, and they were also sheltered. These households were abortion clinics and libraries and political meeting centers, etc. So I know Sarah Schulman has written a book called The Gentrification of the Mind. And when I think about all the young folks I know in New York, like trying to survive, pay back their student loans, and figure out a place to live that doesn't cost a fortune, it's very, very difficult something like the lesbian collective household that sustained a certain kind of resistant political culture, that El Quilombo Intergaláctico, the community center in Durham, these are the targets of voracious neoliberalism. And similarly, or differently, but similarly, resonantly, in Chiapas, the effort to recapture and recuperate the land. Lavender and Red. Lavender and Red, right? That sounds right. By Emily Hobson. It's a very good book. Okay, so how else have people interpreted the formation of the caracols, the Zapatista? I'm not going to, but we could in conversation. I'm not going to talk because I can never remember really the actual structure of, the organization. I can refer you to many. There's the community that has its assembly, and then they send representatives to the municipality, and they send representatives to the caracol. And the main thing about it is that there's constant rotation. So basically what autonomy is, as Subcomandante Marco said, is resistance made into a school. It's a school in democratic participation. And it's kind of great if you come as a solidarity activist and you want to bring a project to the junta, the Good Government Council of, say, the Caracol in Oventique, you come and you make a presentation to the junta and they listen to you respectfully, and you come back the next week and it's an entirely different junta. So you have to go over it again, and they listen to you very respectfully, and they see whether they can find anything in the records, and you come back the following week and it's yet another junta. So I have literally seen this system working, but it's extraordinary because when I first started going, I go there because I have to pay because I take students to language school, so I hand in the money to the junta, and initially it was all men. And most of them couldn't sign their names. They would use their fingerprint. And 16 years later, it's overwhelmingly women. And they, as far as I can tell, they're literate and numerate. And so that's, just a huge achievement and some indication of what's astir inside these communities. That really represents, as some people have called it, the second conquest, the participation of women at every level of Zapatista projects. It's not by any means complete or realized, and the way that you know that is because the Zapatista textbooks, there's one of them that I told you about that you can find online from the Little School, where they compile and present the lessons of their organization of autonomy over the prior 10 or 11 years. And they talk about all the mistakes and all the things that still haven't been accomplished. And that's what, that's what those textbooks are about. So I can talk about some of those in a minute. But just to go on, for some of the other claims that have been made on behalf of the Autonomy Project, like Verstellen, the proclamation of the Caracoles was a decision for a peaceful alternative to taking up arms again. All right? It was a wager that it's possible to construct a peaceful transition toward a viable world which is less authoritarian, less oppressive, less unjust, and which can continue to struggle for peace with democracy, justice, and liberty. So it's a wager for a nonviolent mode of transforming the world. All right. I want to look at what the Zapatistas mean, because people always focus, and it's totally true, on the fact that they don't accept money from the state. No state schools, no state clinics, no laminas for their roofs, nothing, right? But they describe, and that's okay, that's right, that's true, but what's important is the flip side of that. What they say, the reason that they don't accept any money from the state is because they see it as a counterinsurgency strategy to buy off rebels piece by piece. And so their goal, though, I think is larger, that's the means, but it's part of a project to resist all the attendant practices of domination, clientelism, caciquism, etc., that have accompanied receiving money from the state. And I can explain very simply that the mode of political domination in Mexico is through a system that Jeff can explain it much more coherently than I can, but roughly clientelism. That is, you exchange your vote for a road or, a lamina or, whatever. And so it's, what does it mean that's what the Zapatistas are resisting. It's not the literalness of taking money from the state, but the practices that go along with that, the practices of domination, the dependence and subordination to a political class, including an indigenous political class that rules on behalf of federal and ultimately transnational powers. So I have argued that what the Zapatista Autonomy Project represents is a de-alienation of politics, a taking back into the communities and into quotidian daily life of the practices of self-government, all right? And I think that's enormously significant in the Mexican context. The refusal to allow a political class, there is no political class in Zapatista communities, and rotation and all that craziness that drives people from the outside mad has to do with that, all right? It has to do with resistance as a school in participation and democracy. What else? Now, and this is back to neoliberal multiculturalism. The Autonomy Project is also a rejection of what was called indigenismo, right? Indigenism, which was the paternalist project of the Mexican state to incorporate the indigenous into the nation on the condition that they ceased to be indigenous. Right? So the indigenous were cast, right, as in need of education, of modernization, of sanitization, right? They had to become Mexican and cease to be indigenous in order to become Mexican citizens, okay? A key difference between the Zapatista negotiations with the government and the old patronizing indigenism is that the terms of the discussion have fundamentally changed. The future of Mexico depends not on an alteration of the indigenous to conform to the imaginary national standard, but rather a change of the society that would put them in a new relation to the nation that owes them its existence. And remember, all the way back to the first declaration, we are the heirs of the founders of this nation. All right, so that's the insistence, and that's a decolonial insistence, and the argument has been made that the Zapatistas are engaged in refounding the nation in a national, which for better or for worse. Okay, nation and this notion of citizenship that tempers equal rights with the right to be different. Right? And the other ultimate expression of that is autonomy with neither segregation nor secession. Okay, finally, am I talking to, whoops, should I go for another 10, 15? Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. Because I want to talk about the way in which autonomy has been a challenge to the patriarchal order of indigenous communities. So it is widely recognized, especially by outsiders, that usos y costumbres, the traditional customs of indigenous communities, are oppressive to women. And the liberal state has cast itself as the protector of indigenous women against their communities in the name of, say, human rights. All right? So the state will protect you against being beaten by your husband or whatever. All right? And what autonomy for women represents is a rejection of the idea that the source of their liberation is the state, the paternalistic state. They too have a critique of the traditional customs in their communities, but they are the ones that are going to challenge those customs and reform them. They don't want the helping hand of the paternalistic state. Right? And I think one of the most profound challenges of the autonomy project has been, or the most profound achievements, has been the fundamental transformation of gender relations inside the heart of the community. And this is the key wager, that a revolutionary politics can be conceived and practiced that works actively against the reinstallation of old or the creation of new forms of domination. And if I can quote to you from one of the compañeras in the, right, so did you get that? So that what autonomy is a wager that we can really not reproduce within the revolutionary project old or new forms of domination. That can be, because all the revolutionary projects that we know and that they have looked at did reproduce or recreate forms of domination. So autonomy is an open, expansive, protean project that is not a goal but a path. And it's defined in their terms as caminar preguntando. We walk questioning. So it's something that continually changes, and the principle that guides the challenge and change that is the dynamic of autonomous communities is the struggle against all forms of domination. So here's what one of the compañeras says. It is necessary to study the revolutionary law very well because we don't want to make a construction that follows the same history that we've seen. The compañeros who are machistas now command, and if we misinterpret what the revolutionary law of women is about, then the compañeras will command, and the poor little compañeros, they'll be left out. We don't want that. What we want is something like a new construction of humanity. That's what we're trying to change. Another world. That's what is wanted. When wishing to talk about a revolution, it's that they go together. It goes for both men and women. So I think that is the expression of the fundamental wager of the autonomy project, that what is wanted is a new world, a reconstruction of humanity, and that's the horizon. Right? That's the horizon. So it's not, and what you also discover from reading the textbooks is, as I said, is how many mistakes that they make. Every community does things differently. So autonomy, even Zapatista democracy, is not a formula. It's not consensus. It's not majority rule. Each community has its own way of doing things, what they call a democracy of democratic forms, because it's not a program. It's not a set of principles, except the principle to keep on moving toward a society free of domination. So I want to talk about, finally, one example from my own experience of engaging young Zapatista women about how they understand autonomy. All right. In 2007, when I was there, the Zapatista women initiated a discussion about abortion. Right? Which was all the rage, because abortion had just been decriminalized in Mexico City, and the Catholic Church was apoplectic, and all over San Cristobal there were huge banners, with fetuses and blah blah. So abortion was kind of on everybody's mind. All right. And what these young women said spontaneously, one of them, was 500,000 women annually in Mexico have an abortion, sin pedir permiso del Estado, without asking permission of the state, connecting women's practices of clandestine abortion with the project of autonomy that the Zapatistas have undertaken, sin pedir permiso del Estado. When the state sold them out, they created their own autonomous communities without asking permission. Remember the slogan of Comandanta Ramona? We don't have to ask permission to be free. So when they completely eliminated the power of the San Andres Accords, the Zapatista Autonomy Project was to enact those without the permission of the state. That's what the Autonomy Project was, to enact freedom, to exercise power, as opposed to waiting for it to be conferred, or in the old revolutionary vision, seizing it. All right? So they decided to enact their freedom and enact their power, right, sin pedir permiso del Estado, without asking for permission. And that's the way, when I began to realize, as I said, how expansive this idea of autonomy was. So having had that experience of being free without asking permission, it was an easy step to see abortion as women taking their freedom into their own hands without asking permission. Abortion is murder. It's the taking of the life of a human being, another affirmed, but women have the right. I found that startling. Right? Zapatista women were claiming the classic patriarchal prerogative, think back to the Bible, the right over the life of their children, as in their willingness to take up arms. They had already usurped the prerogative of the state, its monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Not to be allowed to have abortions, they said, is how they impede us by forcing us to have 10 or 12 children. We'll impede them from what? Right? If you look at the revolutionary law of women, what the absolutely key right that they demand is the right to participate. The right to participate in all the decisions that are made in their communities and that determine their fate, and the right to fully participate in a collective project to transform the world. And they began to recognize that not being able to have abortions or to control their own bodies was a way that they were impeded from fully participating. This is extraordinary. I mean, this is a transformation in the course of a generation, because, these were Catholic communities, deeply Catholic communities. So, okay. So, I could go on, but I think I want to shift and talk about the resonances of Zapatismo and why. This is the question that has completely preoccupied me, is, why have the Zapatistas caught the imagination? I remember Adolfo Gili, this great historian and who came to the Valley, who's lived in Mexico for a long time, and he looked around and he said, he was giving a talk on the Zapatistas, and he said, why do you young people who live in this beautiful place in the country and have so much at hand, why are you interested in this group of rebels, you know, in the southeastern corner of Mexico? And in one form or another, that's a kind of question that I've been asking and asking my students and asking myself for a long time. So I'm going to make a few proposals, and then you can tell me what you think, all right? I think it is the, shall we say, the illegibility of the Zapatistas that has in fact been very productive. They're about indigenous rights and not. They're about land and material resources, but not exclusively so. They're about demands for dignity and horizontality, for new racial and cultural hierarchies. Despite the fact that all of these claims are absolutely true, they're insufficient, and this I'm drawing on El Quilombo Intergaláctico, to understand the resonance of the Zapatistas. In the words of Subcomandante Marcos, the Zapatistas wanted something more naive and straightforward than all the goals attributed to them. We wanted to change the world. And at a moment when that seemed an impossible dream, the Zapatistas said another world is both possible and necessary. So I think that's part of their resonance, at least for young people. And just on a personal note, when I first went to Chiapas in 1994, I was working on a magazine called Radical America, and we had just put an issue to bed called Living Without an Alternative. And it was like, how do we reckon with the fact that, you know, capitalism is triumphant? It was a horrible time, right? Not that the Soviet Union represented our idea of freedom and liberation, but it represented something that impeded the unhinged march of capitalism all over the world. And there appeared to be no alternative. Fukuyama was proclaiming the end of history. American politicians were gloating in the idea that we had won. So we put this issue to bed and went off to Mexico to learn Spanish. And out of the southeastern corner of Mexico arose on January 1st an indigenous army saying, "You're not alone, another world is possible." And certainly that was the way they came into my consciousness, but I've heard others from the MST and other places talking about that resonance. So that's one thing. Our friends at El Colombo Intergaláctico, they propose that our problem on the left in the United States is not to recognize the depth of the abyss into which we are falling, and therefore, every 4 years, to think that figuring out which politician should administer the abyss is something that should involve all of our energies. And is it maybe time to not think that way? I mean, I know there are lots of young anarchists and others who don't, but it is a very, I mean, when I look at what comes across my feed, it's, you know, it's all about Bernie or versus this one versus that one. It's still, people are already trying to think toward the next election, and it's very, very hard in a system like this not to think that way. That's what the Zapatistas are doing. Again, in Mexico, it's a situation not so dissimilar. You know, the Peña Nieto, who's in power, has unleashed the most incredible violence, and it appears as though López Obrador, the candidate of the left, may have a chance. So already, and yet the Zapatistas launched their other campaign, their indigenous woman candidate for the presidency. But what they say is their candidacy is unlike any others. Because, shall I wait? They are using the presidential race, and as I said, the time that everybody's focused on politics, not to solicit votes. They say, vote for whoever you want to. The point is to organize. And so the candidate of the National Indigenous Council, who they call their spokesperson, and they say we're not allowed by the electoral rules to propose an entire, indigenous governing council of 71 people as the candidate for the presidency. So we've chosen our spokesperson. But all 71 of us are going to go around this entire country in the next year and a half, really trying to propel organizations. So that's their idea of another, vote for whoever you want to, but if we're not organized, then it doesn't matter who wins, is kind of the message. So at least for me, that's resonant. And then, all right, I'm just going to finish if I can, because I spoke for longer than I thought. Can I get... Okay, so last night I got this on email, and I thought it was pretty amazing. Movimiento por Justicia en el Barrio, I don't know if you know the Movement for Justice in the El Barrio in East Harlem in New York, is a group of Mexican immigrant women who are organized to defend their housing. And East Harlem right now is kind of in the center of the gentrification storm, and they are the most powerful resistance force. And they are calling people to a workshop based on the 7 organizing principles of the Zapatistas. Remember those that I showed you? Servir y no servirse, representar y no suplantar. So that's what they're saying, that these principles convey a different way of movement building from below and to the left to construct another world where many worlds fit. And so in this workshop, people are going to analyze real-world scenarios involving those in power through the lens of Zapatista principles and devise alternative outcomes to reflect these. I don't know about you, but I would certainly like to go to this workshop and see what that entails, because these women are so fierce. And I recommend you that you look up their website and click on some of their videos and watch them taking on power in New York City. There's something. So that's one unexpected, and this is the press conference, which we're not going to look at, but I recommend it to you. If you look it up, the CNI press conference English subtitles, you will find it. Now, how do I get to the last slide? Anybody? Here we go. All right, this is another group that I think is, they don't say it explicitly, but I feel as though they are inspired by the Zapatistas. Do you know Movimiento Cosecha? It's a group of undocumented immigrant youth, and these are their principles. They're a nonviolent movement that seeks protection, dignity, and respect for all immigrants. First principle, monkey see, monkey do. We lead by inspiring and suggesting, never by commanding. Our leaders are but trusty servants. They do not govern. Isn't this like straight out of Mandar Obedeciendo and the 7 principles? We all take initiative and respect those of others. It's not about one idea, it's about many ideas. Blah, blah, blah. Principles come before personality. We are all a family. This movement welcomes everyone. We know that our wisdom comes from the voices that are often most silenced. And then they talk about having a multilingual movement. I don't know, I love this one. There's no cover for this party. You don't need permission to participate in this movement. This becomes a reality when you learn about our 3 activist rule. When 3 people decide to become activists in Movimiento, they can form a circle and get full support from the movement. We make our own decisions, and we choose to participate in the activities of the movement that we feel most excited about. We can all party together as long as we follow the principles of Movimiento. There's no dress code for this party. We need musicians, artists, dancers, etc. We don't dance with political parties. Our weapon is non-cooperation. Our shield is non-violence, etc., etc. So I encourage you to look them up. And they're the ones, whoops. Oh yeah, okay. They're the ones who conducted the recent demonstrations in front of the White House against, the repeal of DACA. Anyway, they're quite fierce, and they're coming to Hampshire on November 10th, so we'll get to see them. Oh, I put this up to end because I had all words. This is a mural made by my students in Chiapas, and it's quite, you can sort of figure it, trying to connect. Black Lives Matter. Huh? Colectivo de Margaret. They tried to make it a little social or something. And then, whoops, why can't I find where to, there. And then that's a mural on the Hampshire campus that was painted by the same person who did most of the painting in Chiapas, so I feel as though, and it's a mural to the resilience of women of color. So it kind of carries the same aesthetic and, in a certain sense, politics. So I thought maybe that was, and then one last one, and this is for you because they asked me for a picture, and aside from the one that's on the poster, that was the only one I had. So this is my guardian as we climbed the mountains this summer in Oventique. And to make conversation as I was huffing and puffing, I said, so, were your parents Zapatistas? Oh, sí. ¿Y tus abuelos, your grandparents? Oh, sí. ¿Y tus bisabuelos? Claro que sí. Your great-grandparents? All right, so what that has to do with this is that I've been thinking, since you asked me to be part of this, about resistance. And what does it mean to resist? And I got an inspiration this summer from my yoga class, where the final meditation, it tells you what kind of time we were in, was on resistance. Isn't that lovely? And what the teacher proposed was that there is a term that comes from painting and fabric arts, a resist. And a resist is something that you put over something valuable to protect it from subsequent occurrences so that it lasts, all right? So I was thinking about collective memory and the grandparents and the great-grandparents and, how did Zapatismo come to be? And I was thinking about the Autonomy Project. And another metaphor that I've been thinking about a lot is development in photography, right? Where the basic imprint is there, but with time, right? And over time, the contrast brings out what was there, but only implicit. So I think maybe collective memory works that way. It's a kind of resist that protects things from untoward occurrences. So when its moment comes, it can flourish. So I think that that's what autonomy, which is rooted in indigenous practices, but it's been developed over time by the Zapatistas. So there we go. And I want to get off that picture there. All right. So questions or I don't know.